I'm Ramonda Rakoski from the NGV, and I'm here today with my colleague, Ray Collins. We're excited to welcome you to this special event featuring our guests, David Coles, founder and master paintmaker at Langridge Artist Colours, and Louise Blyton, artist and owner of St. Luke Artist Colourman. For over 2 decades, David Coles has been making high-quality artists' oil paints here in Melbourne, which now retail worldwide. During the lockdown this year, we had an opportunity to speak with David online while he was at his paint factory in Yarraville. We asked David some questions to learn more about the history of Langridge and his extraordinary career as a paint maker. As always, David was very generous with his time and knowledge for this video interview, taking us through the many idiosyncrasies of producing artist quality oil paints, from sourcing pigments to the milling process using a triple roll mill.
In part 2 of this session, David is joined by his artist partner, Louise Blyton, who has been working and exhibiting in the field of reductive art for over 25 years and is also the owner of St. Luke Artist Colourman, a specialty retailer of professional paint and raw materials. And in fact, David and Louise actually were speaking to us from the brand new St. Luke's store, which has just opened on Smith Street in Fitzroy, Melbourne. Together, David and Louise share further insights into another integral part of the paintmaking process, which is the dissemination of product knowledge and the critical dialogue and collaborations that they maintain with the end users of their products, the artists themselves. We hope you enjoy hearing their stories as much as we did.
I grew up in an artist family. My father was a commercial illustrator, and my mother set up, when I was 6 years old, an art store. This is in Henley, which is a small country town about an hour west of London. And that gave me an immediate introduction to art materials. So from a family side, what happened was that basically we were encouraged to be artists, or more importantly, we were not discouraged to be creative, my brother and I. And so we worked with materials, you know, we were borrowing my father's pens and markers and what have you, all his coloured materials, much to probably his annoyance, for ever since I can remember. The real start for me would have been when I was about 14. I started working in the art shop as a Saturday boy or when in the holidays. And, you know, certainly the attitude was to know the materials you were working with, and so I learned very, very quickly. And there were a few books around at that time. Don't forget, of course, this is the pre-internet. So, you know, the information could only be found by buying books. You might be lucky to find something on a microfiche in a library, but it was pretty sparing in the amount of information available. So I learned really by reading some books and just reading up the catalogues from the suppliers. And then I went to art school when I was 17. Of course, then you're really, you know, completely involved in the world of art, of creativity. And I was very lucky. I went to Bristol Art School, which at the time was very heavily involved in methods and materials. So they wanted us as artists to understand how to build the materials we were working with, from something very simple like, you know, stretching your own canvases, making your own stretcher frames, all the way through to actually making your own paints. Some of us took that on with more alacrity than others. Others were just interested in getting into the painting and totally understand that. But there was a handful of us who really got into it. A couple of contemporaries of mine were making encaustic. I was making my own gesso oil grounds and egg oil emulsion grounds, making my own paints just to see what would happen. And so they gave me that kind of introduction to, again, a further introduction into materials. I still didn't really know what I was doing, but also I had a large cohort of teachers at the time who were from the 40s, who were the second wave St. Ives School, and they very much, because of the time with the rationing through the 40s, 50s and early 60s, they had to make their own materials because they couldn't afford or couldn't get hold of actual materials, artist painting materials. So we learned a lot about sort of making do with what you had, but being able to make something really well. And of course, you just needed to know the real nuts and bolts of how materials for artists are put together first before you can actually make them. And then leaving art school, I ended up in London and this was really the massive sort of movement in my knowledge base. I worked for Cornellison and Son, which is one of the last great colour houses in the sense of colour men, art material retailers in the world. One of there is about 4 or 5 still remaining from the 19th century. Cornellison is an extraordinary store, and the knowledge base is immense because you have multi-generational staff members there, and we had incredible training, a lot of it by osmosis, but a lot of us were just very much into our materials, and in the evenings we'd go home and make our own materials. The reason I ended up in Australia was I was traveling, having worked for Cornellison's for about 3 years, and I ended up in Australia because I ran out of money, and I needed a job, and I got a job working for a major art retailer. I actually ended up working for Eckersley's in their Paran store, which was their head office at the time. And immediately sort of remembered what it was like working in art retail again. It hadn't been that long since I've been working in London, but I fell in love with a retail. I fell in love with materials. And I had been considering making art materials at a commercial level back in the UK. The biggest problem is that, Europe is sort of saturated with art manufacturers, whether they're very old from the 19th century, some from the early 20th century. And at that point, we also had, of course, a couple of new players coming in, people like Michael Harding, who's almost a contemporary of mine, a few years older. And there was this definite zeitgeist of the opportunity for new colour makers to enter the field. But of course, I had virtually no money, and I knew the chance of being able to do that successfully in the UK in a very crowded field was very, very difficult. I fell in love with Australia and had to go back to the UK after doing 1 year working tourist on a working tourist visa, and then went back to Cornellison's, worked for them for about another year and a half, learned as much as I could. I was very upfront with Nicholas Walt, the owner of Cornellison's, in regards to the fact that I was going to go to Australia and set up my own manufacturing company. And he very kindly supported me, gave me some incredible old texts which had been out of print for 50 years, 100 years. And I set off back to Australia, down to Melbourne, and set up in November 1992 Langridge Artist Colours in Langridge Street, Collingwood. And we haven't looked back. This was the early 90s. There were second-hand commercial furniture or equipment stores that don't really exist anymore, in the sense that you could pick up metal shelving for $10. You could find some mixing equipment, not electronic, not with a machine, but sort of simple basic materials and equipment. Again, next to nothing. We would mix, and I say we, it was myself, and over the years I'd have one or maybe a second person helping me on a part-time basis. I did most of the work purely because I couldn't afford staff, simple as that. And the mixing is done by hand. In fact, there are some of the mediums that we still make are still stirred together by hand. We don't use machine-driven mixers, often because the quantities we're making are so small. The actual steel containers, mixing bowls would be are too large for those small materials, so we actually do it all by hand. And so we did all the mixing by hand. I can give you an idea of a general day for that first few years. I would get up, because I should mention here that when I say we weren't making much money, I mean I had for the first 2 years 2 or 3 part-time jobs. So get up in the morning, I would take the bus to wherever I was working, and I worked in a range of places, from a small ice cream factory to a art and craft store to a timber yard. And I would come back at the end of the day, and I had produced a printed catalogue, which I had been done in a friend's bedroom because he had a computer and I couldn't afford one. I got it printed. I would then, and on there, the contact number was my home number with an answer machine. But the fax number, which I couldn't afford a fax machine itself, was actually the fax machine for the local printer. And so at the end of the day, I would swing by the printers, I would pick up my orders, I'd go home, I'd make the orders, I'd decant the products, I'd label the products, I'd pack the products, and then book in by fax with one of the shipping companies. I would leave it at the bottom of the stairs behind a rolling security grill that could easily be opened. It wasn't locked. And then I would leave for the day again for another part-time job. And I came back, those products being picked up and it being shipped to our first retailers all over the country. After that first couple of years, we were lucky enough, I was lucky enough to take over the ground floor of that building we were in. It was a 2-story building, so we had upstairs, that's why it was so cheap. After about 2 years, the company that was underneath wanted to move, and I could just about afford to take on the whole space, which I did. That was great because then it allowed us storage downstairs and allowed us also, because the cash flow was now starting to build up quite nicely, to be able to start ordering our raw material stock, in particular our liquids, so our oils, drying oils, and our solvents. We could move to 44-gallon drum lots or 200-litre lots, which gave us enormous amounts of, it was a large shift in the cost basis. It gave us a lot better pricing. And so that gave us a big move up because we had a lot more floor space. It still wasn't huge, but it was enough for us at that moment in time. And the history of Langridge has always been moving to a larger space as our capacity grows. But of course, the storage, one of the hardest problems about manufacture, especially in art materials, is storage, and storage of packaging, not even storage of raw materials. Packaging, which in essence means we're storing a lot of air, is one of the most difficult things to control. So after about 2 years, we were able to increase our capacity by moving to the ground floor. And then as we expanded our product offering, we started to get more retailers very much interested in our product. And really around about 1998, 99, the general public, certainly in Melbourne, started to really pick up on our product. And we ended up getting people coming to our factory door wanting to do factory purchasing because, of course, with the idea that it was going to be cheaper than going through an art store. And we couldn't really obviously do that because it would have been we would have been selling behind the back of our retailers who had built a relationship with us. But it certainly started our ideas about maybe looking at setting up our own flagship store to promote our products in the way that we wanted to. And this is at this point I'd met my wife, Louise Blyton, and so we started working around that. With that, we started to necessitate the idea of looking at a larger space, and which obviously came very soon after. How Australia changed me and formed the direction of the sort of some of the ideas about what Langridge is really came through slowly, but almost then became focused when we launched the oil colours. I suddenly realized by producing final colours and that the colour selection I made, I wanted to find a space I wanted to find a place for this new paint making company. I wanted to find a place for this that was unique from any other paint making company. And one in particular was probably to a certain extent aimed at Australian artists because we're all of a shared experience. And those shared experiences include in particular the environment. The biggest thing I still think about with Australia, especially when we come back from having gone overseas to see friends and family, is how huge the skies are here. I know there are parts of the world where obviously probably just as large, but Australia seems to have these huge skies, and especially also with us living on the sort of the coastal fringe, again a kind of a quality of light bouncing from back again up off the ocean. And so the colours I started to develop became an actual evocation of that. It suddenly was an epiphany. It took an epiphany that took like 2 years, but still a coalescence of an idea that how we could make an honest story that we truly believed in, and it was just being sort of, written down, as it were, rather than being sort of floating around in my head. And that was that we are creating Australian colours. There are one of the biggest things with these large skies and the dryness of the environment here is that colour is sunlight strikes objects unadulterated by moisture. So it's not being filtered in the same way that certainly for myself coming from Northern Europe would know and experience. And as though that pure light strikes objects and hits the colour within, or creates the colour within from those objects, it bounces back to us in a much more direct way. And it seems, in my mind, this is obviously more emotional than scientific, but it seems to vibrate in a slightly more excited way than, as I said, light that's distributed through moisture or just a lower level of light anyway. And so all the colours seem to vibrate. I think that Australians, probably almost impossible to truly, great someone actually would do a massive sort of test. But I think that Australians have a understanding of colour that's differentiated from certainly Europeans, apart from maybe from around the Mediterranean. The level of light, the heightened colour in this country, I think is quite extraordinary. It certainly struck me from the moment I got here. And so the colours have been built to reflect that. Throughout this period of the 90s, I was experimenting with materials. My first love are oil paints, and they're oil paints because I'm an oil painter myself, and I know the product. I know the product very, very well, or at least I thought I did. You never stop learning. However, there's one major defect to making oil paints and making oil paints well, which is you need a machine, and you need a triple roll mill. Quite simply, there's no other machine will truly make an artist's oil colour to the level, and certainly in the quantities that we knew we would need to go to without going to a triple roll mill. The triple roll mill is the machine you can see behind me right now. The problem with triple roll mills, one, they are extremely expensive. They are, especially in this country, very few and far between. The vast majority of them were dedicated to the commercial ink making industry, or they might have been used somewhere in cosmetic manufacture, cosmetic gels and creams. So without having the money to be able to purchase one, I started looking at other materials we could look at making. Some materials that could be made maybe with high-speed dispersers, could be made at a much lower sort of technical level. Now, to make an artist acrylic paint of the level of, say, someone along the lines of Golden or Liquitex does take extraordinary science, and I wasn't attempting to make something quite to that level. I was looking at making some basic acrylics because I knew there was a gap in the marketplace. And so we started experimenting and learned the hard way, in a sense, in very, very quickly. We learned that artist acrylics are actually quite difficult to make. The big difference between oil paints and acrylics, in my mind, oil paints are easy to manufacture, relatively, because they have very few components, raw material components, but it's actually very difficult to use from the artist's perspective because there's enormous amounts of issues with dry rates, stresses, flexibilities, etc., yellowing. With acrylics, it's the other way around. It's a very easy material to work with. Basically works off evaporation. It's highly elastic. The binders very rarely, if selected correctly, they don't yellow in the same way that a drying oil will. But they're very, very difficult to manufacture with a minimum of 14 components. Certainly this is everything I've learned, having become very close with Golden Artist Colours, who have been for the last 10 years their Australian distributor, and personal conversations with Mark Golden, one of the founders. So we attempted with acrylics and fairly quickly decided to move away because we couldn't really satisfy the market to the level that I wanted. I wanted to be able to make bodied acrylics. It becomes a much more difficult issue than making fluid acrylics. We then looked at casein paints, and at the time I was able to get hold of casein pre-made in a solution, a strong syrupy solution, and be able to actually add pre-dispersed in water pigments, a little bit like how we would make acrylics. We pre-disperse the pigment into an aqueous solution prior to dispersing into the actual binding media. And that was great, and that was actually very successful, and something that I'm still very curious about with casein, because I think it's an extraordinarily underrated media. It has, of course, as always, a couple of defects. The first one is the marketplace doesn't understand it. So even if we made a superlative product, we would then have to go on a massive education, and this has always been an issue at Langridge. We're attempting to explain to our artist customers and to the retailers why our product is differentiated and why that matters. Because without understanding of that, then people can literally make no choices on their products other than price, or maybe it's been recommended by another artist or a friend. So we need to educate the market that way. So the third thing that we looked at, because it was still oil-based materials, but because we could make it without the machinery like a triple roll mill, was we started looking at oil sticks. And oil sticks are separated from oil pastels. Oil pastels, really developed by Sennelier in the early 19th century, are a non-drying material, a non-drying stick, colored stick. Oil pastels, in the most simple description, would be oil paints that have been thickened with large quantities of a wax or a thickening agent, normally a wax, so that they are in a solid form, a little bit like a crayon, and you're drawing with oil color. And that interested me because, again, it allowed me to say that I was making oil color, but it was in a graphic form and something that we could do. And I investigated how to do it. Wasn't that much information, but enough. I found a local manufacturer here in Melbourne to make me a mold, and we would then mix the molten wax with the drying oil. Depending on the color, some colors may have needed a controlled amount of cobalt or calcium dryers. And then the pigment would be mixed in by high-speed mixing, and whilst molten, poured into the molds. There was a lot of trial and error with that. We would end up many days with benches just covered because the seal at the bottom of the mold failed on us, with the molten colored wax pouring all over the factory floor. So, and then of course, as soon as it hits, by the way, because it's wax, as soon as it hits the cold surface, it immediately sets. So then we'd spend another 3 hours chiseling cold colored wax off the factory floor, only to know we're going to go back to start all over again. But we perfected it, and we were very happy with it. But it wasn't really a large enough market. I've become friends over the last few years with Richard Frumes, who is the founder and still the managing director, I believe, of R&F Encaustic in the US, who are certainly the world's leading oil stick manufacturers. And I've been to his factory. I can't believe how tightly controlled that process is there. The real future for me in commercial sense was to make an oil paint. So finally, to get a triple roll mill, I had a customer. I got first of all a twin roll mill that was given to me by the artist Phil Hunter, the late Phil Hunter, who was a friend of mine, probably I would suggest one of the most important late 20th century Australian landscape artists. And he'd worked for many years for Ed Marcus, and Ed Marcus had a manufacturing company called Marcus Art, later called Sage Art. And this was actually one of Ed Marcus's first twin roll mills that he had. Phil had been given it by Ed, and Phil gave it to me. So that was my first mill, and it was a twin roll mill, the rollers were about this long in length, about 30 centimeters or so. They were but it was nice, but it was still very limited what I could do with it, because there were only 2 rolls rather than 3. The amount of shearing action meant that it was much less than a triple roll mill, where you have 2 faces of shearing going on. So the amount of passes was doubled in essence. So paint making was a very slow process. I was able to get a triple roll mill a couple of years I would say, in probably about 2002. And then finally, in about 2006, we were able to purchase the mill behind us. And it's a large German triple roll mill with porphyry roll faces, not steel. And the beauty of that for us is that it gives very slightly more open surface. It allows a slightly higher shearing action so that the pigments are dispersed or separated from each other and then fully dispersed throughout the binding medium far more effectively than on just straight steel. The difference probably in the grand terms is not that large, but it's enough that allows us to be able to get within a time allotted, if one wanted to look at that. And we don't make our paints purely within the idea that we can make it all in, say, 3 hours or a day. Some paints take longer, they take longer, especially with the pigments that are very finely divided. But the beauty of using this machine is that face gives us a chance to separate those pigments much more aggressively without burning either them or the oil. And we can get normally a couple of extra passes in within a particular period of time. We picked it up second hand from a gentleman who had come, and I'd given him paint making training because he was an artist who wanted to make his own paints. And normally I try to, let me put it this way. When artists want to make their own paints, I'm very, very supportive because I think it's an incredible process to learn, and it puts enormous connection between the artist and the materials they're working with. This is obviously something that artists up until really, the late 18th century, early 19th century, all artists were heavily involved in. They were making their own colours as a general rule. Pre-made oil colours or artist colours were not readily available. And with that break, and with the introduction of the creation of the colour makers, start to see this divorce of knowledge by artists. So for artists to make their own paints, I think it's a great idea. However, the reason behind why they should do it is more complicated. And I think a lot of artists think that they can do it because they can save money. And yes, they can save money, but the problem is that, as I say to them, every hour you're making paint is another hour you're not in the studio. What do you want to be? Do you want to be a paint maker? Do you want to be an artist? And I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive, but one will start to rub up against the other, and a decision eventually after a few months or a year has to be made. And there are some artists I know who do make their paints from scratch, mainly because they can't buy it in the quality they need in that particular form. And I'm thinking of artists who work in egg tempera, aren't really, because of the nature of egg and its high protein content and the fact that it tends to be rather unstable in liquid form, you have to make it fresh. But for oil paints, of course, we've been able over the years to actually, over 100 plus years, 200 years, we've been able to perfect that actual formulation and the delivery system in the tubes. And this gentleman had basically been making paint. He did it for about a year, and then he abandoned it and disappeared. And his sister, about 2 years later, phoned me and said, I have this enormous triple roll mill taking up the whole garage. Do you want it? Because my husband can't get his cars in the garage. So I got it for a song, to be honest with you. It was one of those lucky breaks. It's probably worth around about $30,000, $35,000 even secondhand. And I got it for a lot less than that. And it's been the stalwart of our manufacture ever since. Without that machine and the scale that it's on, it's a large triple roll mill. We wouldn't have been able to increase our production. We wouldn't have been able to increase the batch sizes and make sure that we could look after that burgeoning demand from Australian international artists. Yeah. Sourcing of pigments. We obviously approach the companies, and as I've mentioned earlier, these might be companies that are highly respected with a long history. And of course, we look through their product listings, we look at what they are available, equal to what the function we need, and we request physical samples. They're sent to us. We then evaluate them by moving them into small batches, mini batches, which can be down to start with at the most basic level. I've got a muller and a slab. and I've got some linseed oil, and I will literally wet it out, mill it up, and just see how it performs. Because, many pigments will alter quite dramatically when saturated, when wetted out. Even a manufacturer on their data sheets will often give you an idea of their particle size spread through mesh size, micron size. But you can't really tell what that's going to do until you get the physical material in front of you. And as a general rule, modern organic pigments have much finer particulates. They have larger surface area, so they operate or they mill out completely differently to the older inorganic pigments. Sourcing those pigments has become more problematic over the last few years. Again, mergers and acquisitions, so that's larger pigment companies have been buying out smaller pigment companies. So that the opportunity for plurality, for having options to look at different manufacturers and slight different qualities in those pigments being made has become more and more narrow. We have a naphthol red, which of course, the naphthols are relatively, older modern azo technology. And yet I found this naphthol red, which was very much moving in a color space towards yellow. It had a lot of yellow within it, yellow hue, whereas most naphthol reds, in particular, most manufacturers use a naphthol red ASD, which is much more blue. And I wanted something a little bit pinker, shall we say. And the company we used to go to got bought up by another company. The new company were also making supposedly something in the same color space, but it wasn't. So we had to then go searching around the world to find a pigment that had the same color space. That's difficult because our customer base are extremely color specific, and they will notice changes. In all the years that we've been offering color, but in particular since we launched our oil color range, we have had to change the pigments selected from the original grouping, from the original selections. About 6 pigments have changed, and they've changed because the supplier can't offer it to us anymore. Either because the pigment literally is now out of production, because the reason for its initial creation was probably something like the auto industry, and that color is now no longer fashionable from the actual car maker, so they stopped the pigment being made. Or it might be mergers and acquisitions, or it might be that the company that we used to purchase from in this country, the distributor, has changed the brands that it wants to support. So it's an ongoing, keeping a very close eye on our offerings, what's being offered to us, to make sure that we have continuity of supply. Obviously, use a digital system with regards to the formulations. At any point where alterations in formulations have to occur, everything is notated down, both in a digital form and in a analog form. When the paint makers come to make each batch, they will print up their sheet, their manufacture sheet, and obviously mark off as they make their way through all of the processes. They mark down, and in our process, in our record keeping, we make notations in regards to the number of passes. We fineness of grind, so we have a Hegman gauge to make sure we can notate down what obviously micron size and dispersion we believe we've got to. The paint makers will obviously fill out that analog, that printed out formulation. It's then archived. I'm looking at some just off camera, and we have an archive room upstairs which has got dozens and dozens of completed paint making sheets. Also, during the paint making process, towards the end, it's requested of them also to do drawdowns, and I think you can see those behind me, behind the mill. So we do drawdown tests to check for dispersion again, as well as the fineness of grind gauge, but also physical. Also to make sure when put into a tint, we use a control white, which is our titanium white, which doesn't change in formulation. So we always have this as a control white. Even if for some reason we were to change titanium white in the future, we will continue to make that tinting white for internal use only as our control white and keep it to that original formula. So we can cross-reference, obviously, against what's happened on previous batches. What we're looking at is making sure that, in particular, the tint tests and the undercolor tests are always sitting in the same color space as previous manufacturing runs. We also keep 2 tubes of every single color from the run. It's archived, and they're again kept in a archive room. So again, we have all the tubes of color that, of course, and they're related to the actual manufacture sheet. So we can, in theory, tie the manufacture sheet archive up against the actual oil paint archive. Yeah. It's important because for us, not only do I actually believe in archiving, I do, think that this could be an important resource for the future for conservators or for an institution at some point. Most importantly, the imperative, however, is that we're often working with artists, and occasionally they'll contact us believing that the paint that they bought from us has failed, and we need to be able to go and cross-reference the paint that they've purchased. Obviously, there's a batch number which is being stamped into the crimp on the bottom of the tube, and so we can go and cross-reference against our own sample of, and hopefully work out if there has been a failure or whether there's just been a conflict of material application.
We've been working on this for the last 3 months, mainly during lockdown, so we've been pretty lucky to be able to concentrate on it. This is our 3rd shop and our last shop. This is our final home. We started on Gertrude Street, and we started the store originally because when David had his factory down on Langridge Street for Langridge Artists Colours, we had so many people knocking on the door every day to buy his products, but they weren't trying to get a discount, they weren't trying to get wholesale. What they were trying to get was information about the products and the use of products. And I guess that kind of passion that we had, that they were very excited about that. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could set up an art store the way that an artist wants an art store, rather than just as a retail shop. So passion and enthusiasm, and most importantly, knowledge about the products, and really helping people through the use and problem solving with them. So that's how St. Luke's started, and it happened quite quickly. We kind of did it on a whim, just like that. Bang, we were open, and this was 2000. Then we needed a bigger store, so we moved down to Smith Street, and we've been there for 14 years. And I have been looking at this shop literally across the road for 14 years, thinking that's the shop that St. Luke needs to be in. Like, we need this store, we need to showcase it the way that we really feel passionate about. We're probably frustrated designers, I think. But we wanted, a lot of our customers, they get so much enjoyment and excitement about coming into the shop because of the way we display the products, and hopefully just enthusiasm for using the products too, and a joy, because a lot of them, as artists, we lead very solitary lives. So coming to the art store can be kind of like the big day out. You come in and want to have a good chat and want to talk about brushes and paints and varnishes, and that's what we love. We really get that enjoyment from the customers as well.
In regards to materials that we supply through St. Luke that are part of interaction from requests from artists, probably I would suggest our brush ranges would be an area in particular where we listen very carefully to artists, because artists and their use of their brushes is very specific, it's very individual. And to the point where, because we have a relationship, St. Luke imports directly from France the Léonard brush range. We have access to a very wide range and some quite unusual brushes, and we actually are holding and have held for many years brushes that we wouldn't probably ourselves as artists have actually thought about bringing in, but they have particular functions. The other one is actually on the pigment side. There are some pigments that have been requested by artists, and because they are quite esoteric, we've had to bring St. Luke themselves, had to bring those in and sell them exclusively, because there unfortunately isn't enough margin for Langridge to wholesale to other retailers. It's not that occasionally has occurred, such as bringing in genuine lead white, and many of these pigments obviously are for professional use only, and also because it's only sold through St. Luke, it gives us control over that interaction to who we sell to. So we're not selling it to children, as an example, something that might be of danger.
Yeah. We're very nosy about how people use their materials. And they're often very generous with telling us exactly what they're going to use it for. So if someone was to pick up some genuine Naples yellow, then we would give them the information and maybe suss them out a little bit and hope, say, be cautious with this.
Over the 21 years of St. Luke, 21 years of St. Luke, I can give you multiple examples. Artists such as some very early ones. The sculptor and printmaker Tim Jones wanted an Yves Klein blue paint, literally that vibrated for an exterior. He was painting on cast brass sculptures, some Jacob's Ladder type sculptures. And I developed initially for him the actual, what we call now ultra saturate blue. It was so successful for Tim and on his projects that we expanded it into a standard product within the Langridge range. It still sells like crazy. We're legally not allowed to say Yves Klein blue. There is still a trademark on that term, so that's the reason for our naming of ultra saturate blue. But in essence, its colour space and the nature of how it's constructed is extremely close to the original IKB of Yves Klein and Robert Adam. Other artists, Matthew Johnson, wanted to have watercolour discs made for him that he could stick onto a watercolour paper and then actually wash with water and let them bleed out. I'm trying to think of a couple of others. We actually had she later became a staff member. Brielle Hanson is a New Zealand but Australian-based artist who was doing, I think, her master's or PhD at RMIT, and she wanted basically a bath of what looked like milk that she could project water drops hitting the surface, so it was as though it was a living surface. She tried using just adding white pigment and other white material to the water, but of course, because they're particulates and have a specific gravity, they would consistently drop out. I worked hand in hand with Brielle to create a thickening agent so that the material, the actual liquid, the water, wasn't solid. She still wanted it to have some kind of opportunity to move for a kind of a ripple effect. But she obviously needed the water to stay white for extended periods of time. So I was able to work with her, create a thickening agent for the water that still allowed some fluidity and held in suspension the titanium white pigment. And again, selection of pigments allowed us to use smaller quantities. And in the last few years, I suppose, Ash Keating, who graduated from working in street art into the fine art area, a magnificent artist, very ambitious artist, who wanted to work with his spray application, sort of the fire hydrant application of colour, and needed something that was extremely fluid and that the actual binding agent didn't interfere with the colour. So he had full control because he would also be washing off certain amounts of the colour as well in the process. So we worked very closely with him to develop a find, first of all, and then offer and make for him a highly fluid acrylic resin-based solution. And allied to that, we also have a range of pigments that we now pre-disperse in water, so he can also tint in a very easy manner. And one of the other things is it's all well and good to come up with a solution for an artist's problem, but if it means that the artist is jumping through horrific hoops, often, of course, they won't follow through. So we have to make the actual mechanics of the whole process as easy and as simple as possible, so that, in a sense, the materiality of artist products is removed. It gets out of the way of the artist being creative. And then the final one in the most recent year is working with the artist Hu Yun, I apologise, Hu Yun, who is actually showing at the moment up at Queensland Modern Art Gallery at Quagmire, a series of watercolours, and he's interested, obviously, the work is about the use of the environment, and in particular certain metals or elements and their interaction with human or life, and obviously poisoning, and it's a very bad way of describing something, where he's looking at the actual materiality of the actual colour itself. So he was looking for the elements for copper, for lead, for titanium, and many others, cadmium, etc. And he approached us to be able to create a range of watercolour paints and each of the colours were based on specific actual elements. And that meant some from readily available pigments, such as the cadmiums, but some, especially the copper-based, where I sourced some beautiful quality malachite pigment and azurite pigment. So I could actually make a custom-made watercolour for his actual, for this project. So it's been a continuous, and they're just some of the highlights. I mean, we've had literally hundreds of artists over the years where we've worked very closely, and that's just on custom. Yeah, that's just on the custom projects.
I would say we definitely see a trend in the shop over the last 20 years. Colours coming in and out of fashion constantly. I would say personally, I think especially in the last 10 years, a research in really bright colours, really, really bright. People are after intensity of colour. An explosion of pink in the last 5-6 years, I would say. You know, when you think back to the 80s, no one was using pink, really. Very few artists. Maybe Philip Guston, you kind of think, oh yeah, pink man. But now it's like with so much pink, and also it's a lot of problem solving because it's actually quite hard to mix a good pink. So we see that happen a lot. We've had the fluoros coming back in majorly, which is really difficult because they're not light fast. So we have to kind of burst a lot of people's bubbles saying, well, you know, we've got it, but you know, just be really careful. Also the pearlescents have become very, very popular, but I would only say probably a fairly tight handful of artists continue using them because they're quite difficult to use. Also, what we find really funny in the store, and we have a laugh about this almost every single day, is someone will come to the front counter with a colour. 90% of the time, they're wearing that colour. Like, it's astounding. It's absolutely astounding. And it could be the weirdest colour in the world, and sure enough, their handbag is that colour, or their shoes are that colour, or their shirt is that colour. It's quite funny. And we love pointing it out to people too, because they get a kick out of it as well. First, open St. Luke and dealing with the pigments every day, as I said before, like letting customers open the jar and seeing this raw material, and then going home because we lived above the factory, and then seeing David over big, beautiful buckets of just raw pigment. And I became obsessed with, I want that. I don't want to use paint. I just want to use pigment. And I want that dry, super matte, just pure colour. Very, very hard to get. Took me about 2 years to really perfect it by getting the right linen. Many, many coats of dry pigment brushed in with spray varnishes over the top, experimenting with varnishes. And, you know, so that was a really big change in my work, because before that I was using mainly greys and blacks and, you know, lots of layers of glazes and stuff. So then I went the opposite, and I went really bright and pure colour. And I guess because I was trained as a printmaker, I'm used to problem solving, and I'm used to knowing about my materials. Because you're really trained as a printmaker. You have to know about your inks, your paper, the process, the acids, the resins, you know, a lot more than, unfortunately, painters are trained. So I embraced those changes quite a lot. As the years went on, and the works that I was doing with pigment were very, very fragile, obviously. So as I started exhibiting more overseas, where I wasn't there to supervise the handling of the work, I became more interested in going towards the acrylics, the golden acrylics. They just behave so beautifully. And all the mediums, it's great, because there's a medium that will do any problem you want, there's a medium that's going to fix it. So I was able to change my materials but keep the same essence of my work by doing that. And that does boil down to knowledge of your materials. And this is what we keep saying to people, is the more you know about your materials, the less money it's going to cost you and the less time it's going to take you to do things. So we really push that as like, get to know what you're using, work out the problems. And if you can't, that's what we're here for. But yeah, so you really do need to know about your materials. They're your tools, and so you have to work with them. So the more knowledge you have, the better. Well, I think with St. Luke, I think, as I said, we finally found our true home. We were lucky enough to be in a great position to actually purchase the shop. So we finally feel this is it. We're not going to move it again. Hopefully we just keep doing what we do and expanding more on that knowledge base, and, you know, continue having fabulous staff that we train within an inch of their lives, and very passionate people that work with us. I think it's just important to have this kind of shop in Melbourne. Our customers are incredibly supportive, and they really do feel part ownership in the store, which is fabulous, because we've known so many of them now for 20 years. We've watched them have babies. We've watched them become grandparents. We've watched them go from doing a Saturday life drawing class to doing their masters at VCA and having solo exhibitions. Like, it's just been such an incredibly fabulous road, and I just look forward to more and more of that, and continuing this journey with the customers and the artists, and meeting new ones too. Like, it's never a dull day in here. You never know when the doors are open. You never know who's going to walk in, whether they are buying pigments for icons or fake eyes, glass eyes. It's just crazy. There's so many interesting people in this city, and I think that St. Luke should really kind of sing their praises a lot more, because we're incredibly lucky in Melbourne. There's so many incredible artisans and artists in this city at the end of the world, and I think we all need to celebrate them a lot more and support them is the most important thing. So hopefully St. Luke continues to do that.
And yeah, I absolutely agree with Louise on that. That's right. I mean, just to continue that lovely sort of interaction between ourselves and the practitioners across, artisans to painters to conservators, etc. And obviously we'll continue to listen and increase certain areas where we can. And obviously once we come out of the pandemic, correct properly, things I think might make things a little bit easier for us to really start investigating some new materials. From Langridge's position, the future holds more colours. We are working and have for the last year been working on more colours, in the oil paint range, some new mediums, specific to customer demand. More pigments, a lot more pigments. Yeah. We're about to introduce another 20, 25 new pigments in the next month or so, and that will be never ending. There is never, as far as I'm concerned, an end to the. You can never have too many pigments, as far as I'm aware. And the more esoteric, the more in love with them I am. So I finally tracked down, as an example, tracked down a gentleman who has been making for the last 7 to 10 years. He's making genuine Tyrian purple. We obviously, these are things that excite me. I think these are things. It's sad, isn't it, really? But these are things that I think excite a lot of people within the industry. I know it. I know some yourself and Ray and other conservators. Get very excited by something that for many people might be seen as quite weird. But there's nothing more to me more beautiful than pure colour. And especially the older pigments in a way, even though, from a painter's perspective, I think the modern pigments are more effective. But from a pure pigment and their histories, the poetry and, the luxurious stories and mythology behind them sort of draws me to them. And it has really almost from the first time I started working in an art shop back in the UK in the early 80s. There you go. Yeah.
And I think this is a big thing because our shop's now 3 times bigger. And after the success of the Chromatopia exhibition, 4 years ago, we're lucky enough to still have all David's samples of things.
The exhibits, yeah.
So we've got cabinets in here now and they'll all be labelled. So it'll be like a mini museum in the shop. So because a lot of people they want to come into St. Luke, but they don't feel like they belong because they're not an artist. But what we want to do is we want to share this passion with everybody. So now we thought, well, if we've got these 4 beautiful cabinets full of weird, wonderful, crazy things, so anyone can walk in here and get an education if they want. They can stand there and read it. And people are endlessly fascinated with these things, as we saw from the exhibition. So it wasn't really the artists, it was everyday people was so fascinated that colour had a history. And I think that's going to be a really big part of the new St. Luke, is to educate more people that aren't artists. So hopefully those people will then have an appreciation for the arts, realising what an amazingly rich cultural family it is. So I think that's going to be a really big thing.
Oh, I agree.
For the new St. Luke.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, Louise mentioned Chromatopia. So just to let you know for the future, just because I get bored very easily, apart from having helped Louise set up and create the new St. Luke, and obviously everything we're doing future for Langridge, Chromatopia is an original exhibition in 2017. The book, Thames and Hudson book, Chromatopia, coming out in late 18, early 19. And now we're in pre-production for Chromatopia, the TV series. So that'll keep me busy for the next couple of years.
Yeah, hopefully.
There you go.